wondered how life began on Earth? Well, first, the universe needed to be created, which occurred about 14 billion years ago with the Big Bang. Scientists agree that the Big Bang happened since the universe is known to be constantly expanding, but can't explain how and why it happened. About 10 billion years later, scientists believe the Earth looked something like this before life began, as it was cooling down from its very hot beginning. Scientists think the Earth's atmosphere contained mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, but are not sure. About 1 billion years after the Earth was formed, fossil evidence indicates simple life began. Some scientists believe that lightning strikes, serving as an energy source, allowed chemicals in the atmosphere and shallow, watery areas, known as primordial soups, to react to form the building blocks of living cells. Other scientists think that life began in hydrothermal vents near the ocean bottom, where chemical-rich gases from the Earth's hot crust percolated up through the water and where no deadly UV radiation from the sun could reach. Note that the ozone layer had not yet formed at this time. Still other scientists suggest that meteorites from outer space may have brought some of the original building blocks needed for life. About 3.5 billion years ago, life most likely first began with single-cell microorganisms, such as algae, amoebas, and/or E. coli bacteria appearing in watery environments. Sometime later, higher-level organisms, such as man and woman, appeared on Earth. There are several puzzling and controversial aspects as to how we arrived at our current human form, most of which are beyond the scope of this video. Instead, life must have started somehow. In this video, we'll explore the two main theories. So the question is, did life begin guided by an intelligent creator, as indicated in the Bible and Quran, and taught by all of the major Western religions, or did it result from spontaneous generation, as indicated in many school science textbooks? Many scientists have conducted experiments to see if the spontaneous generation theory has any chance of being correct. Such experiments have produced a few of the small building blocks of life. However, no large biomolecules critical to life, such as DNA, RNA, or proteins, have been produced in such experiments. This image is thought to be similar to the first living cells on Earth. Such cells are made up of millions of microscopic components. Cells of higher-level organisms are even more complicated. When Charles Darwin was contemplating the origin of life and thinking about his famous origin of the species doctrine in the mid-1800s, a cell was thought to be a relatively simple thing. So it was assumed it could have been formed from a few chemical reactions occurring by chance sometime over a period of millions of years. DNA, RNA, mitochondria, and many of the other components of cells were still unknown. Today, it is recognized that a living cell is very complicated, far more complicated even than anything that intelligent mankind has ever created. So a major question regarding the origin of life is how the many complex systems and structures of living cells came to be. So let's take a closer look at a living cell from various perspectives. This image shows a small portion of the thousands of different chemicals and chemical reactions going on inside a living cell. The reactions involve proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and many other compounds. Some of the chemical pathways represent how cells obtain, store, and utilize energy from food nutrients. The chemistry involved in cells is far more complex than any non-biological industrial chemical plant ever designed and built by man. Since many of the components in this diagram are proteins, let's take a closer look at a typical protein. These images are of insulin, which is a relatively small protein molecule. An insulin molecule has a molecular weight of almost 6,000, compared to 18 for a water molecule. Each of the beaded groups in the left image represents one of 20 different kinds of amino acids. So an insulin molecule consists of a specific sequence of amino acids connected together and folded into a very specific three-dimensional shape, both of which are required for the protein to function as intended. Of course, cells also contain lipids and carbohydrates, but proteins are discussed here as they are involved in all of a cell's critical functions and are the main target of known DNA activity. So what is this cellular structure and chemical complexity working to accomplish? Much of how a single microscopic living cell is structured and how it functions has been likened to an intelligently designed multi-billion-dollar chemical manufacturing plant. A cell has a boundary fence, which is the cell wall, security systems, which prevent unauthorized access through the cell wall, entry facilities for raw materials, like foods, shipping facilities for finished products, internal chemical transport systems, power plants, which are called mitochondria, waste disposal plants, internal machines for making proteins, which are called ribosomes, internal quality control systems, an army of workers with many different skills, called enzymes, messengers, which is messenger RNA, and blueprints and manuals for making things, which is DNA. In fact, when it comes to choosing between using living cells or non-biological synthetic processes for making certain commercial products, the obvious choice is often to use cells. About a third of all products made by pharmaceutical companies begin with the process using single-cell microorganisms. For example, most of the world's insulin is made by E. coli bacteria and yeast cells. One wonders if some sort of plan or design existed to create such efficient and highly capable cellular organisms, much like a plan and design are needed to create an industrial plant. A key component of cells is DNA, required for a cell to operate, grow, and reproduce. This image shows a tiny portion of the DNA inside a cell. DNA is, in part, a cookbook of recipes, which are instructions as to how a cell is to make the different proteins it needs. A DNA molecule is a double helix-shaped molecule, like a circular staircase, with a specific sequence of connectors which connect the two strands of the double helix molecule, being a code of letters that make up genes. So a gene is the recipe code for making a specific protein. For the very simplest single-cell organisms, the number of connectors in a DNA molecule is 5 million, which contain instructions for making over 4,000 different proteins. By comparison, the number of connectors in a molecule of human DNA is 3 billion. As some of the extraordinary features of DNA, the DNA molecule in each human cell contains more information than 100 volumes, which is 5 sets, of Encyclopedia Britannica. DNA can store about 1 million times more data per unit volume than the most sophisticated information storage devices developed by humans, such as hard disks and memory sticks. And DNA is more than 10 million times more energy efficient than working with the equivalent amount of data in man-made computer systems. This contributes, for example, to the brain being able to operate on 10 to 20 watts of power, while supercomputers of similar capacity require several megawatts of electricity. So how could unplanned acts of chemistry in nature have produced such an amazing computing and information storage mechanism, far exceeding anything the world's greatest computer scientists have yet created. DNA is much more than a string of chemical molecules. It is a repository of information, stored by means of a unique language that has all the properties of other languages developed by mankind. That is, DNA uses an alphabet of 4 letters, using 4 different chemicals. The letters are organized into codons, genes, and chromosomes, much like the letters in a book are organized into words, paragraphs, and chapters. So DNA is an informational code. Information does not and cannot arise spontaneously by random processes. Intelligence is a necessity in the origin of any informational code, including the genetic code. That is, all known codes were developed by intelligent creators, including all the world's alphabets, numerical system, the Rosetta Stone shown here, Morse code, and the 0 to 1 code used by computers. Theories such as spontaneous generation and evolution that rely solely on matter and energy are not going to be able to account for information. Only intelligence can. That is, in DNA, neither chemistry nor physics laws naturally arranges the letters into the assembly instructions for proteins. The cause of letter arrangement in DNA must have come from somewhere else. NASA and universities have established radio telescopes to analyze signals from outer space. Intelligible communications in received signals would be widely hailed as evidence of an intelligent source. If DNA's message code were received by such radio telescopes, it would be hailed as evidence of an intelligent source, as it contains all the attributes of a language. Why, then, is DNA's message sequence, as observed on Earth, not considered by some scientists as coming from a source of intelligence? Dr. Francis Collins, leader of the Human Genome Project, noted that DNA is our own instruction book, previously known only to God. Also, at the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, when scientists had mapped the 3 billion letters of the human genome, a project that filled the equivalent of over 75,000 pages of the New York Times newspaper, President Bill Clinton said, scientists were, quote, learning the language in which God created life. One of the amazing abilities of most cells regards cell reproduction. Has intelligent mankind ever designed and built a machine, even with just a few parts, that can reproduce its entire self within half an hour? Bacteria cells can, and they have millions of parts. Actually, most kinds of cells, including most human cells, can reproduce their entire cells whenever needed, and don't take longer than a few hours to do so. So where did the instructions required for self-replication come from? When attempting to understand how life might have begun, one encounters several chicken and egg paradoxes. For example, the replication of DNA molecules, which occurs during every cell division, requires the assistance of many different proteins. But proteins require DNA for their construction. So which came first, proteins or DNA? They each require the other. Another paradox relates to the attempt by scientists to create life in the laboratory. One of history's greatest scientists, Louis Pasteur, who is the father of microbiology, is also the father of a field called biogenesis. Biogenesis claims that all life is from life. Some scientists believe in the opposite paradigm, called abiogenesis, meaning that life arose from non-living matter. Pasteur's famous biogenesis experiment, boiling nutrient-rich broth in closed and open flasks, shown in this image, provided evidence that life only comes from other life. No laboratory or other experiment, including those run by brilliant, world-famous scientists, has ever demonstrated the creation of life from non-living matter. which begs the question, how did the first living cells come to be? So the two theories, first, life coming only from other life, and secondly, life coming from non-living matter, both developed by scientists, are in direct conflict. Only one can be right. A difficulty in creating and maintaining complex systems is keeping them viable. There is a well-known physics law called the second law of thermodynamics. It argues that all systems left on their own without outside influences will tend towards a state of disorder. For example, cars, pumps, buildings, airplanes, computers, and other non-life entities without externally provided intelligent input will always tend towards a state of decay and disorder. Likewise with living things, that is, without external influences, all cells will eventually succumb to a state of disorder due to DNA mutations within cells, natural cell death, injury, and disease. Our bodies will eventually return to dust as the ultimate form of structural disorder. So how did the necessary millions of interlocking and interdependent components and systems, instructions, and energy sources get organized and come together at the same time and place to create the first living cells, when such components, even if they existed, were far more likely to succumb to environmental forces and decay, such as from UV radiation from the sun destroying any exposed large biomolecules. Such cells have far more working, interacting parts and systems than most complex Boeing 747s with its 6 million parts. Since organisms such as humans obviously spend part of their times growing up and becoming bigger and smarter, one wonders how this came to be, given the complexity of life in the first place and all the life-destructive forces and natural tendencies towards disorder and death that exist. It would seem some sort of design, plan, and creativity were involved. Another perspective comes from the statistical odds of life having been formed from random chemical events. As background, the odds of winning the Powerball lottery are about 1 in 10 to the 8th, which is 1 in 100 million. The odds of a person flipping a coin and getting all heads or tails is much worse than this, being less than 1 chance in 10 to the 31st power, which is 1 in 10 followed by 31 zeros, which has never happened in the annals of known recorded coin flips. Even worse, the statistical equivalent of 0 is considered by mathematicians to be 1 in 10 to the 50th. So, consider the odds of a 100 amino acid specific protein correctly forming in the right sequence from a mixture containing the 20 kinds of different amino acids that form the building blocks of proteins, and then folding into the correct three-dimensional configuration. Famous American astronomer and astrophysicist Dr. Carl Sagan, who hosted the popular TV series Cosmos for many years, has calculated the odds of this occurring as worse than 1 in 10 to the 130th power. Statistically, this is 0. And this is just the probability of constructing one specific protein by spontaneous generation. There are thousands of different proteins in a cell. Dr. Sagan is quoted as saying, "However proteins were first constructed, it was not by random assembly." There are a host of further questions that arise when considering how higher-level organisms developed, including many dealing with human characteristics. It is not known how evolution could have caused them. For example, how did man develop the ability to discern right from wrong and take the correct fork in the road when a moral conflict exists? Imagine John Valjean's dilemma in the popular Broadway play Les Mis on whether or not to steal a loaf of bread when trying to help a starving child. Another question is, how did organisms develop that can repair most of their own broken parts and repel invaded intruders by themselves? For example, has a car ever been developed that can change its own tires? Another dilemma is how did emotions develop in humans, such as happiness, sadness, frustration, joy, and anger? These are things that can't be measured with physical instruments. Additional questions to ponder include, how did a brain develop that can rewire itself and not crash like a computer when a few million neuron memory cells die, which occurs to most of us almost every day? And how did humans acquire a soul, which is a spiritual entity separate from their physical body? Proponents of spontaneous generation and evolution can't explain these things. Perhaps intelligent design has been involved. Regarding what scientists believe, the National Academy of Sciences has noted that whether God exists or not is a question about which science is neutral. In 2009 and 2018, surveys were conducted by the highly respected Pew Research Center, interviewing members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The results indicated scientists are split roughly 50-50 on whether or not God or a higher power exists. So scientists themselves are not in agreement as to how life most likely began. Many scientists who aren't fans of creationism aren't fans of the science-sponsored theory either. They just don't believe a God exists. Should you always believe what science teaches as fact? The answer is usually yes, but not always. Remember that science at one time taught as fact that the Earth was the center of the solar system, which was taught by Greek scientists. That our sun was the center of the universe, taught by Copernicus. That outer space was full of ether, allowing for light transmission. That other elements could be converted to gold, which was the field of alchemy. That only 3 states of matter exist, gas, liquid, and solid, when it is now known that 99% of matter in the universe is now known to be plasma, which includes lightning, neon lights, and the makeup of stars in the universe. So it is sometimes valid to question what science teaches. Regarding the origin of life, hard experimental evidence is in short supply for both the 2 main theories that exist. The U.S. government seems to believe that God exists, even a creative God. God appears in all currency, displaying the words, "In God we trust." God, the Creator, also appears in the Declaration of Independence. Reference to God also appears in the Pledge of Allegiance, every president's inaugural address, every state constitution, and many other public documents. So why does public education not only refuse to acknowledge the existence of God in their science curriculums, but teaches an alternative theory of the origin of life as fact? This, even though what they teach is not fact, but an unproven theory, unsupported with experimental evidence, and with very little chance of being correct. Until one is proven correct, the philosophy of science would suggest both major theories be presented as theories and not fact in the education of students. If this video whets your appetite and you want to learn more, it's available in a new book available via Amazon and most bookstore chains. The book includes a summary of conditions in the universe that makes life possible, discusses some of the complexities of living cells, discusses some remarkable functions of human organisms, includes quotes from famous scientists, and lists many references for further reading. The book is The Origin of Life and Humanity, a layman's view of creation versus natural phenomenon. It is authored by a biochemical engineer based on an extensive literature review in his own industrial career working with microorganisms.